here. Okay, listen to this coolness.
Into human hearing range. When she played an actual audio recording that had been digitally shifted to bring the frequencies into human hearing range. The resulting sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Partly mechanical, partly organic, with modulations that created an almost language-like cadence. She also shared a detail that connected directly to my experience. These acoustic anomalies were most active between 2:30 and 3:45 a.m. and appeared concentrated in a quarter-mile radius, centered on what her maps showed to be the exact location of the spring I had discovered. I asked if she had any theories about the source of these sounds. She hesitated before admitting that her preliminary analysis indicated the sounds originated from at least 80 feet below the surface, possibly deeper. Most rated what appeared to be responsiveness to human activity, changing patterns when her team was present versus when only automated equipment was recording. Whatever was generating these sounds seemed aware of being monitored. As our conversation concluded, Dr. Sandoval mentioned something that connected to another aspect of my research. She said her team had documented significant electromagnetic anomalies correlating with the acoustic events. These EM spikes had been detected by equipment designed to monitor lightning strikes, but occurred even during clear weather with no storm activity. When mapped over time, these anomalies formed distinct geometric patterns centered on the same area. This information led me to investigate the unusual wildfires that had affected Tonto National Forest.
Now I think you need to have the hot wildfires to boil all the minerals to get them into the limestone to turn into gems.
Between May and August of 2024. Through a contact at the Regional Forest Service office, I gained access to internal reports, not included in public releases. What I found defied conventional wildfire behavior. 5 major fires had started simultaneously at points forming a perfect pentagon, with the approximate location of the spring at its center. More disturbing was data showing these fires had burned at temperatures exceeding 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit in certain areas, significantly hotter than typical forest fires, and more than hot enough to melt the aluminum casings of Dr. Sandoval's recording equipment. I also discovered that in 3 instances, fire crews reported their communications equipment failing specifically when they approached certain areas within the burn zone, as abrupt as I remembered. One moment surrounded by normal nocturnal forest sounds, the next in complete silence. My EMF detector immediately registered readings significantly above background levels, fluctuating in a pattern that matched the vibrations I had felt during my previous visit. My watch and primary GPS unit began malfunctioning, but my backup GPS continued working, though with reduced accuracy. As I neared the clearing with the spring, the air temperature dropped noticeably, at least 15 degrees within a few dozen yards. My thermal camera showed the ground around the spring was significantly colder than the surrounding forest, appearing as a dark blue circle against the warmer greens and yellows of the forest floor. More concerning was a vertical temperature anomaly that appeared as a cooler column extending upward from the spring into the night sky, visible only on the thermal display. I set up my equipment approximately 30 feet from the spring's edge, positioning the cameras and audio recorders to capture the entire clearing. As I worked, I began feeling the now familiar vibrations, stronger than during my daylight visit. My EMF detector's readings spiked dramatically, following the same 753 pattern I had noted before. At approximately 1:40 a.m., I observed a phenomenon that defied explanation. The surface of the spring's pool, which had been completely still, began to oscillate in geometric patterns, perfect concentric hexagons rippling outward from the center, despite there being no apparent physical cause for the disturbance. The thermal camera showed the water temperature was now below freezing, registering at 29.7 degrees Fahrenheit, yet it remained in liquid form. At 2:17 a.m., my audio equipment captured a series of sounds that were actually audible to my ears. Low resonant tones that seemed to come from beneath the spring, gradually increasing in volume and complexity. These sounds resembled nothing I've ever heard in nature. Partly metallic, partly organic, with modulations that created an almost speech-like rhythm. The sequence lasted exactly 108 seconds before abruptly stopping. What happened at 2:43 a.m. is the reason I'm writing this. The air above the spring began to distort, similar to what I had glimpsed during my first visit, but far more pronounced. The distortion formed a vertical oval, approximately 9 feet tall by 4 feet wide. Through this distortion, the opposite side of the clearing was no longer visible. Instead, I could see what appeared to be a corridor or tunnel illuminated by a diffuse bluish light. As I watched, paralyzed between scientific curiosity and mounting fear, a figure appeared in this apparent opening. At first, it was just a silhouette backlit by the blue light, but as it moved closer to the threshold between wherever that corridor was and the clearing where I stood, details became visible. The entity, I cannot bring myself to call it a person, was approximately 7 feet tall, with proportions that were almost, but not quite, human. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow. It appeared to be wearing some kind of fitted garment that covered its entire body, though in the thermal image, no distinction existed between this covering and what might have been its skin. Both registered as a uniform cold temperature. Most disturbing was its head, which was elongated and angular. With no visible hair or facial features, I could discern except for what appeared to be large, slanted eyes that reflected the light from my headlamp when it turned toward my position. This reflection was unusual. Rather than the typical eyeshine of a nocturnal animal, it produced prismatic color separations, like light through a crystal. The entity remained at the threshold for approximately 20 seconds, seemingly observing the clearing. Then, it lifted what I presume was its hand and appeared to be manipulating something I couldn't see. Immediately, my equipment began to malfunction. Cameras shutting down, audio recorders emitting high-pitched feedback, my EMF detector displaying impossible readings before its screen went dark. I remained absolutely still, fighting every instinct to run. The entity then extended its arm toward the pool, and the water began to move upward, defying gravity to form a floating sphere approximately 2 feet in diameter. This sphere rotated slowly while maintaining its perfect shape, occasional ripples moving across its surface in those same hexagonal patterns. The vibrations I had felt earlier intensified to the point of pain, and I experienced a pressure inside my skull that made it difficult to maintain consciousness. Through this physical distress, I observed the entity step partially through the threshold, one limb extending to touch the floating sphere of water. Where it made contact, the water appeared to crystallize instantly, forming fractal patterns that emitted their own soft luminescence. At this point, my backup GPS unit emitted a loud alert tone, indicating its battery was critically low, though it had been fully charged when I began my hike. This sound seemed to startle the entity, which withdrew its limb and turned its attention directly toward my position. Though I was concealed in the shadows of the tree line, I had the distinct impression it could see me perfectly. The sensation that followed is difficult to describe. I experienced what felt like a probing of my mind, intrusive thoughts and images that were not my own, accompanied by emotions that ranged from clinical curiosity to something resembling alarm. I heard no voice, yet I perceived clear communication. I was not supposed to be there. I had witnessed something forbidden, and my presence had been detected by others who would now come. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or even look away, as the entity raised both limbs toward the distortion behind it. The oval rippled and expanded slightly, and I glimpsed movement beyond, additional figures moving toward the opening, their forms less distinct, but similar in their wrongness. What broke the paralysis was the sound of my personal locator beacon activating on its own, something that should have been impossible without manually pressing the emergency button. The high-pitched signal it emitted caused the entity to make a rapid movement, and the distortion in the air collapsed immediately, taking with it both the entity and the floating sphere of water. The spring's pool, which had been partially depleted by the levitated sphere, rapidly refilled as if water was being pushed up from below. I gathered what equipment would still function and retreated along the trail, moving as quickly as I dared in the darkness. The forest sounds gradually returned as I put distance between myself and the spring, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. Twice I spotted unusual movement in my peripheral vision. Tall, thin shapes moving parallel to my path, but always disappearing when I turned to look directly. I reached my vehicle shortly before dawn and drove straight to Phoenix without stopping. In the following days, I discovered that most of my equipment had been rendered inoperable. The cameras and audio recorders that had shut down at the site would not power on again, and when I disassembled one camera, I found its internal components had been partially melted, with bizarre crystalline growths forming along the circuit boards. Only my backup GPS unit had continued functioning, and when I checked its data log, I discovered something impossible. According to its timestamp, what I had experienced as approximately 35 minutes, from 2:43 a.m., when the distortion appeared until my retreat, had actually been over 3 hours. The log showed my position had remained stationary from 2:43 a.m. until 5:52 a.m., more than 3 hours of missing time that I have no memory of. Even more disturbing was a series of coordinates recorded by the GPS during this period, locations where I apparently traveled while having no recollection of doing so. These coordinates form a perfect spiral pattern, extending outward from the spring before returning to my original position. The GPS data shows I covered nearly 2.7 miles during this spiral pattern, all while I believed I was standing stationary at the edge of the clearing. In the weeks since this encounter, I've experienced persistent after effects. I suffer from frequent migraines accompanied by visual disturbances, geometric patterns in my peripheral vision that resemble the hexagonal ripples in the water sphere. I've developed a sensitivity to certain sound frequencies that cause physical discomfort when encountered. Most concerning, I occasionally experience brief episodes of missing time, moments where I suddenly find myself in a different location, with no memory of how I got there, though these episodes typically span only minutes rather than hours. I've attempted to research further connections to historical incidents in the area, but have encountered unusual obstacles. Electronic records I had previously accessed regarding Paul Fugate's disappearance have been removed from databases or heavily redacted. Most alarming was my discovery that the game trail leading to the spring no longer exists. I attempted to return to the site last week, following the exact GPS coordinates from my previous visits, but found the landscape completely different. Dense vegetation and rock formations that made passage impossible, as if that section of forest had been deliberately altered, or my memories of the path were somehow false. Yesterday, I received an unmarked envelope at my home containing only a newspaper clipping from 1977 about the search for Paul Fugate. Someone had circled a quote from a search team member stating that tracking dogs had followed Fugate's scent to a specific location before uniformly refusing to continue. Handwritten in the margin were the GPS coordinates of the spring I had discovered, followed by the words, "They have been here longer than us." One final thing I think that's important to add is that during the moment when I felt that alien consciousness touched my mind, one clear image was transmitted to me. A network of tunnels extending for miles beneath the forest, connecting to larger chambers deep underground. These tunnels formed a pattern identical to the spiral path I apparently walked during my missing time. A pattern I've since recognized in ancient petroglyphs found throughout the Southwest, dating back thousands of years. Whatever dwells beneath Fossil Creek has been there for millennia, and I fear my intrusion has drawn its attention not just to me, but potentially to anyone who becomes connected to this information. If you guys enjoyed today's stories, be sure to smack